Well, thank you for that generous introduction. I was going to say something about something she said, and I forgot already. But anyway, very pleased to see you all here. Hopefully I don't look as old as somebody who's been at it for 50 years, but I am that age. So anyway, I'm sure many of you, upon seeing the title of the presentation listed on the website, Brevity and the Art of Haiku, figured that this might be a short talk. Brevity and haiku means short. Haiku are brief, but to talk about how they are brief, or how to make them brief, or why they should be brief, can take up a lot of time. Hardly a way to make the evening brief. When it comes to brevity, Lorene Niedecker, who was not a haiku writer, but had the right attitude about writing a poem or a haiku. Let me read her poem, Poet's Work. Grandfather advised me, learn a trade. I learned to sit at desk and condense. No layoff from this condensery. Brevity may be the soul of wit and important to the genre of haiku, but life is short and art is better. So I'm going to avoid any theorizing about brevity in haiku. Most of the time, I'll spend reading many of my haiku, which are brief and non-haiku poems by other poets whose work is not as brief as mine, but still shorter than War and Peace. This is not meant to reflect poorly on them, but it is my way of sharing the works of other poets I enjoy with you. You can contrast the brevity of my haiku with longer forms. There will be interjections of my own prose remarks also. This is the Eliot Society, T.S. Eliot, not George, and I suspect many of you wonder, does haiku have anything to do with T.S. Eliot? Or what is my connection with to the poet? What are my Eliot bona fides? Eimus tum, tu an ego, cum vestra contra caelum extendit. Some of you with fine ears might have picked up through my wooden translation, bad pronunciation, of a Latin version of the first two lines of T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. In the second year of my high school Latin, our teacher, Mrs. Wedine, wanted us to do some project with the language. I decided that translating Eliot's poem into Latin would fulfill the requirement. Mrs. Wedine was quite impressed that a high school student not only knew who T.S. Eliot was, but liked his poetry enough that he wanted to translate one of Eliot's poems into Latin. It was a fascinating process turning the words and grammar of one language into another. I had some good help from Mrs. Wedine, who had taught Latin since Ovid was a boy. I'm sure in the end, everybody's old when you're that young. I'm sure in the end it was a very wooden rendition. There are other poems by Eliot in my life. There were other poems by Eliot in my life. I never found memorizing a pleasant or enjoyable experience, but one of the few poems I have ever memorized was Death by Water, part 4 of Eliot's poem, The Wasteland. But rather than trust my memory, now I'm going to read it. Phlebas the Phoenician, a fortnight dead, forgot the cry of gulls and the deep sea swell and the profit and loss. A current under sea picked his bones in whispers. As he rose and fell, he passed the stages of his age and youth, entering the whirlpool. Gentile or Jew, O you who turned the wheel and looked to windward, consider Phlebas, who was once handsome and tall as you. Now, I memorized this when I was 19 or 20 years old while in college. And any of you who are as old as I am or older might well remember that the Vietnam War was still going on. The draft was in full force. Things were a mess on the domestic scene. The shooting at Kent State had happened or was about to. And two men a few years older than me, from my own small hometown in northern Maine, had been killed in Vietnam since I had begun college in the fall of 1968. I'm sure at the time, in my mind, there was some worry, some connection between youth and death. I have since outgrown that feeling, since even people in their 50s are young to me. And now it is death by old age. Two things about this poem have caught my attention in recent years. As far as the connection with my own haiku, it is in the line, forgot forgot the cry of gulls and the deep sea swell. Some of my haiku have dealt with the sea and some with the gulls. I'll read a few of them. But before I do that, just to let you know that part of my procedure is to repeat each haiku twice. That way, if you miss it the first time, for whatever reason, there is a second time. Also, it helps to close the poem. Haiku are so short that one might think there should be more to it. If I repeat it, you won't be left thinking there should be more, because that is all there is. If I repeat it, you'll know the end has come. I was going to say, Billy Collins, who is quite a well-known contemporary American poet, thinks repetition of a haiku is good, at least in one of his poems. He is very popular, and if you ever have a chance, you probably would enjoy hearing him. And usually, one of the things about him is usually he can find his latest book in any bookstore that might have a poetry section. And that doesn't, contemporary poets don't usually end up in poetry sections of many bookstores. He wrote a book about a favorite haiku, probably a Japanese one, although I don't think anyone really knows which one. And perhaps he doesn't know himself. Anyway, Collins' poem is called Japan, and I'm going to read the first two stanzas that show the effect it has had on him as he read it more than once. Today I pass the time reading a favorite haiku, saying a few words over and over. It feels like eating the same small, perfect grape again and again. And if I happen to repeat a haiku more than twice or say it only once, then you can blame it on my own inattention or old age, or that I like it so well that bears more than one repeat. The haiku. At the gull's feet, the ocean spreads itself thin. At the gull's feet, the ocean spreads itself thin. Careful steps, rocking the boat, rocking the top of the ocean. Careful steps, rocking the boat, rocking the top of the ocean. In what's left of our footprints, what's left of the wave. In what's left of our footprints, what's left of the wave. Tied up fishing boats, gulls giving sunrise sound. Tied up fishing boats, gulls giving sunrise sound. Our bare feet next to each other, next to the ocean. Our bare feet next to each other, next to the ocean. Another well-known poet wrote, "Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer." That's from Psalm 19. Yes, very high standards for anyone who speaks, and especially anyone who wants to write a poem or a novel, or even speak to one's family and friends. Very early on, as I thought about writing poetry and what it might mean as a believer in my life as one of God's creatures, I bumped up against this passage in Genesis 2. Now out of the ground the Lord God had formed every beast of the field and every bird of the heavens and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called every living creature, that was its name. The man gave names to all livestock and to the birds of the heavens and to every beast of the field. So there it was, a legitimate calling for any poet, and especially for a writer of haiku, naming the moments of life, naming a state of being or moment in time with words just like Adam named the creatures that God brought to him. Years later, I discovered that T.S. Eliot said something similar in a book review he wrote. Quote, "The poets in question have, like other poets, various faults, but they were at best engaged in the task of trying to find verbal equivalents for states of mind and feeling." Now to get back to David the poet, in the beginning of Psalm 19 he writes, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words whose voice is not heard. Their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world." Well, my words as a poet may not go out to the ends of the world, but there is no reason not to let them attempt a flight. So words about creation are a high calling. We have all of creation for our subject matter. They are for the poet to name and name again, since none of us have the last word. I also have appreciated for a long time T.S. Eliot's comment about the poet's mind, and I think it applies in a very direct way to the mind of a haiku writer. Quote, when a poet's mind is perfectly equipped for its work, it is constantly amalgamating desperate experience. The ordinary man's experience is chaotic, irregular, fragmentary. The latter falls in love or reads Spinoza, and these two experiences have nothing to do with each other, or with the noise of the typewriter or the smell of cooking. In the mind of the poet, these experiences are always forming new wholes. I think a good poem should always form a new whole, a complete work in itself. I suspect some of you are thinking, so what is a haiku? I have been assuming you know. The genre does come from Japan and has been a standard form for over 400 years with its own rules and changes as the years went by. It showed up in Western poetry making in the 19th century, but it only say it has become an important and significant genre since the 1960s. The English language haiku has taken what it understood from the Japanese practice and has been creating its own version of the English language haiku. The Haiku Society of America years ago defined the haiku as the essence of a moment keenly perceived in which nature is linked to human nature. The essence of a moment keenly perceived. It is not exactly just a nature poem. There's a popular notion that a haiku is simply a nature poem about trees and bees and green grass and written in 3 lines of 575 syllables. I think of the haiku as a form in which the creature connects with creation. Creation is not some other reality that man stands outside of. Man can't stand outside since man is part of God's creation. One of my favorite contemporary systematic theologians is John Frame. He recently retired from Reformed Theological Seminary in Florida. He wrote a 4-volume systematic theology, which I read through at a very slow pace as he published them over the years. Anyway, in volume 2, he made this very helpful point about creation. Quote, "We learn something very important about the biblical worldview. In Scripture, the personal is greater than the impersonal. The impersonal things and forces in this world are created and directed by a personal God. According to the naturalistic thought, all persons in the world are the product of impersonal forces, and they can be understood by reducing them to impersonal bits of matter and energy, or by making them aspects of an impersonal oneness. In these views, persons are reducible to the impersonal. But in the biblical view, the impersonal reduces to the personal. Matter, energy, motion, time, and space are under the rule of a personal Lord. All the wonderful things that we find in personality, intelligence, compassion, creativity, love, justice, are not ephemeral data doomed to be snuffed out in cosmic calamity. Rather, they are aspects of what is most permanent, most ultimate. They are what the universe is really all about." Unquote, end quote. I think poetry is a very intense expression of our personality. Poetry comes from deep inside our being. It wasn't that I had not known that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was personally interested in our lives, but Frame's statement highlighted in a fresh way what writing poetry said about us as humans. I wrote to John Frame expressing my appreciation of the point he made and what it meant for the poet. Frame's reply was excellent. Quote, "Yes, poetry is among the things that are fundamental to the universe, since it is the work of a personal God. He is himself a haiku poet who puts vast meaning into every moment and every little thing," end quote. So you can see it's good to read some systematic theology and to get a theologian as excellent as John Frame on one side. As I mentioned, many think of the haiku as being a poem about nature, and a sugary version of it at that. Rather than give you an embarrassing example of a haiku like that, one that even I might have written way back, I'm going to use Joyce Kilmer's poem, Trees, as an example of that kind of thinking. For the fun of it, let me read Kilmer's poem. By the way, we are commemorating the 100th anniversary of our country's participation in World War I, and when the United States entered the war in 1917, Kilmer enlisted in the Army. He was killed in action in 1918 at the Second Battle of the Marne, a young man of 31. Anyway, Trees by Joyce Kilmer. I think I shall never see a poem lovely as a tree whose hungry mouth is pressed against the sweet earth's flowing breast, a tree that looks at God all day and lifts her leafy arms to pray, a tree that may in summer wear a nest of robins in her hair, upon whose bosom snow has lain, who intimately lives with rain. Poems are made by fools like me, but only God can make a tree. By the way, I agree that only God can make a tree, but I am not willing to go along with the statement that poems are made by fools. Believers should always be careful of that particular name calling, since Jesus himself warned that we could be liable to the hell of fire by using it on others. Of course, Kilmer appeared to only call himself a fool, but by implication, anyone who makes a poem falls into that category. Let us leave it. One can't argue too long with a dead man. When I first started thinking I could write poetry, I would write or could write poetry, I thought I would like to be a writer of light verse. Ogden Nash and Richard Armour were two very well-known light verse writers at the time. So just to enjoy one of Nash's verses at this time, I'm going to read his parody of Kilmer's Trees, called Song of the Open Road. I think I shall never see a billboard lovely as a tree. Indeed, unless the billboards fall, I'll never see a tree at all. I don't think billboards are quite the same problem for us now as they were in 1932 when Nash published the poem. But just as a billboard, no haiku is as lovely as a tree, but no haiku is meant to be the tree or hide one either. A haiku may use a tree in whole or in part to frame the moment. Now for a few my haiku with trees or some version of them in it. More footsteps, the broken branch breaks again. More footsteps, the broken branch breaks again. Hanging on our Christmas tree, the ornament broken years ago. Hanging on our Christmas tree, the ornament broken years ago. Shade trees on both sides, the same road Napoleon took. Shade trees on both sides, the same road Napoleon took. T.S. Eliot has not been the only poet whose work I've enjoyed from my youth. I discovered the poetry of William Stafford very early on. I thought he had a very distinctive voice and thoughtful way of saying things, simple and straightforward, but with twists that open one's eyes to other ways of seeing the world. Here's one poem which I think catches his poetic voice well. It's called Bess. Ours are the streets where Bess first met her cancer. She went to work every day past the secure houses. At her job in the library, she arranged better and better flowers, and when students asked for books, her hand went out to help. In the last year of her life, she had to keep her friends from knowing how happy they were. She listened while they complained about food or work or the weather, and the great national events danced their grotesque, fake importance. Always, pain moved where she moved. She walked ahead, it came. She hid, it found her. No one ever served another so truly. No enemy ever meant so strong a hate. It was almost as if there was no room left for her on earth. But she remembered where joy used to live. She straightened its flowers. She did not weep when she passed its houses. And when finally she pulled into a tiny corner and slipped from her pain, her hand opened again and the streets opened, and she wished all well. So the world of one librarian. Cancer certainly is a nasty scare word in our modern world. And I've written two haiku dealing with the disease, but both with a more positive outcome than Stafford's. The heat in the room, the heat in our breath, his cancer back. The heat in the room, the heat in our breath, his cancer back. Cancer survivor, a basket of shells picked off many beaches. Cancer survivor, a basket of shells picked off many beaches. The heat in the room is an old haiku, over 20 years old. The fellow who showed up at the prayer meeting and whose cancer was back is still alive. And of course, the cancer survivor is still around. But not all cancer stories end up positive. My 30-year-old niece was diagnosed this past August with acute leukemia and began chemotherapy for it at the University of Maryland Medical Center in Baltimore. But in the process, she developed an infection which she was not able to overcome with all the help of modern medicines, machines, and drugs and doctors. One can still die in the best medical facilities money can build and furnish and with the smartest doctors medical science can train. A crowd flowed over London Bridge, so many I had not thought death had undone so many. Two more lines from T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, which echo a line from Dante's Inferno. Since we are speaking of death, there is a tradition of death poems within the world of Japanese poetry, usually concerning the poet. Many times these haiku are written when the writer knows death is near, but not always. Some have prepared their death poem well in advance, as they know death and taxes are going to happen. I have written some haiku about death, but not at this time any reflecting on my own death, but the death of family and friends. Before I read any of those haiku, I'd like to read a poem by Jane Kenyon. I only got to know her work about 15 years ago. She was the wife of Donald Hall, another prominent 20th century American poet, who you might know. He is still alive and writing, going for prominence in the 21st century. Anyway, this poem by Jane Kenyon, by the way, she died in 1995 from leukemia. Otherwise, I got out of bed on two strong legs. It might have been otherwise. I ate cereal, sweet milk, a ripe, flawless peach. It might have been otherwise. I took the dog uphill to the birchwood. All morning I did the work I love. At noon I lay down with my mate. It might have been otherwise. We ate dinner together at a table with silver candlesticks. It might have been otherwise. I slept in a bed in a room with paintings on the walls and planned another day, just like this day. But one day I know it will be otherwise. So some haiku with the topic of death. Snow on the ground, snow on my good shoes for the funeral. Snow on the ground, snow on my good shoes for the funeral. Mom's home, the last cup she drank from. Mom's home, the last cup she drank from. Graham's funeral, spring wildflowers showing their colors. Graham's funeral, spring wildflowers showing their colors. Home for Dad's funeral, not the same quiet in the kitchen. Home for Dad's funeral, not the same quiet in the kitchen. We slide her casket out, the small loose stones under our feet. We slide her casket out, the small loose stones under her feet. Dad's funeral, the same knot in my tie. Dad's funeral, the same knot in my tie. The car's horn makes us look behind, the first Christmas without her. The car's horn makes us look behind, the first Christmas without her. I'm going to read a poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins, Spring and Fall, which I was made aware of many years ago. It is probably the only poem of Hopkins I can read without too much stumbling. Also, for many years after reading the poem, I kept saying goldenrod for golden grove when saying the first two lines from memory, so the memory is not very good at times. Spring and fall to a young child. Margaret, are you grieving over golden grove unleaving? Leaves like the things a man you, with your fresh thoughts, care for, can you? Ah, as the heart grows older, it will come to such sights colder. By and by, nor spare a sigh, through worlds a wanwood leaf may lie, and yet you'll weep and know why. Now, no matter, child, the name, sorrow springs are the same, nor mouth had, no, nor mind expressed, what heart heard of, ghost guessed. It is a blight man was born for, it is Margaret you mourn for. And the last two lines are sort of like a variant on John Donne's often quoted lines, and quote, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee, unquote. So the same with autumn leaves. So like Hopkins, I've written haiku about autumn leaves, many of them, just like autumn leaves. Here are a few. The sound they make, the sound I make, autumn leaves. The sound they make, the sound I make, autumn leaves. The shortcut the school children take, a new layer of leaves matted into the old. The shortcut the school children take, a new layer of leaves matted into the old. To hear them walking more slowly, leaves falling. To hear them walking more slowly, leaves falling. Children running from the playground, the leaves left to scatter by themselves. Children running from the playground, the leaves left to scatter by themselves. Waiting out the rain, leaves caught in the bus stop shelter. Waiting out the rain, leaves caught in the bus stop shelter. Now, these were all about autumn leaves. And here's a favorite poem by Robert Frost, which focuses on the problem of spring leaves. Nothing gold can stay. Nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold, her early leaf's the flower, but only so an hour. Then leaf subsides the leaf, so Eden sank to grief. So dawn goes down to day, nothing gold can stay. Walls have been a controversial political topic in recent years, but walls have been important throughout history. I was old enough to remember when the Berlin Wall went up, but not the Great Wall of China. The building of the Berlin Wall was quite the news at the time in 1961, and there were many photos in the local newspaper of it being constructed and stories about people making their escape while the wall was still small enough. Some successful and some unsuccessful. The wall wasn't meant to keep any riffraff out, like so many walls in times past, but to keep the riffraff in. It was a sorry comment on one regime's status with its population. Years later, I was able to view the Berlin Wall when it was a wall, keeping people in, a zoo for humans, a rather strange tourist experience. Years later, I was back in Berlin after the end of the Cold War, a Berlin no longer divided by the wall. The wall was so gone I could no longer find where I had touched it and taken a few chips from it during my first visit. Anyway, there's a well-known poem, Mending Wall, by Robert Frost. I remember hearing it read on TV when the Berlin Wall was going up. The first line of it is, something there is that doesn't love a wall. And the last line, he says again, good fences make good neighbors. Here are a few of my haiku written before walls and fences became a recent controversial topic. Cloudless walls not as old as stone. Cloudless walls not as old as stone. Back road in Maine, a fence doesn't stop the house from falling down. Back road in Maine, a fence doesn't stop the house from falling down. Dew hanging on the fence, paint chips off the danger sign. Dew hanging on the fence, paint chips off the danger sign. Partly fog, partly fence, the edge of the road. Partly fog, partly fence, the edge of this road. Protected by warning signs, walls left by the Roman Empire. Protected by warning signs, walls left by the Roman Empire. Morning walk, nothing for the stone fence to stop. Morning walk, nothing for the stone fence to stop. I've written many haiku with stars in them. There's always one more thing one can say about stars, or fireflies, or cherry blossoms, or oceans, or snow, or grandsons, for all that matter. And I think I've been determined to say them all. Recently, a verse from Psalm 147 jumped out at me. The psalmist writes, he determines the number of the stars. He gives to all of them their names. I think we are far from coming up with the final figure for the number of stars. At the moment, it is rather huge. And the naming continues, even though God seems to have them all named. He could have told us their names, but I think he likes to see what we come up with, just as he let Adam name the creatures. Of course, with so many stars, perhaps we will run out of names and start putting a number after the name. We'll have Betelgeuse 1 and Betelgeuse 2 and so on. Anyway, some of my star haiku. With the numbers my daughter knows, the stars counted. With the numbers my daughter knows, the stars counted. Letting the dog out, the stars out. Letting the dog out, the stars out. The way back, every star the naked eye can see. The way back, every star the naked eye can see. Early in the night, the stars we can see, the space for more. Early in the night, the stars we can see, the space for more. Cloudy night, places starlight goes in a lifetime. Cloudy night, places starlight goes in a lifetime. Extra cold, stars in their expected places. Extra cold, stars in their expected places. Dark, darker, too many stars too far. Dark, darker, too many stars too far. Other lights than our own, the Milky Way. Other lights than our own, the Milky Way. Whistling an old tune, spaces between stars. Whistling an old tune, spaces between stars. Stars showing up odorless. Stars showing up odorless. Bone chilling, not enough night for all the stars. Bone chilling, not enough night for all the stars. Recently, the 1966 doctoral thesis of the well-known physicist Stephen Hawking was published online. So many people wanted to read it that the University of Cambridge website intermittently crashed. Not something that happens in the world of poetry websites. If they go down, it's probably for technical reasons and not popularity. Anyway, putting Hawkins' thesis online is part of the effort to promote increased access to knowledge from the research done in academia. So what does this have to do with my haiku and stars? Well, Hawkins was quoted as saying, quote, "By making my PhD thesis open access, I hope to inspire people around the world to look up at the stars and not down at their feet, to wonder about our place in the universe, and to try and make sense of the cosmos," unquote. So maybe a few of my haiku create that kind of wonder, and you don't have to read a PhD dissertation. And I don't have a problem with you looking down at your feet. It is also very important to see where we stand on this earth. Snow. There's been a lot of snow in my life, especially in my early life in northern Maine. And there is lots of snow in my haiku, in many of my haiku. One of my favorite contemporary American poets early on in my reading was Robert Bly. I first ran across him when I was in high school, and this is back in the 60s. He later became very well known, not as a poet, but as a leader of a men's movement in the 80s and 90s. There were articles about him and the men's movement in Time and Newsweek and other popular magazines. Those magazines didn't have the same enthusiasm for his poetry, though. I was very impressed with the poems in his first book, Silence in the Snowy Fields, which was published in the early 60s. At the time, Bly was editing a journal called The 60s. It started out as the 50s and would end up as the 70s. I think there was only one issue for that decade. So much for the 70s. I sent him from time to time some of my poetry in haiku. I was writing in the 60s and 70s. I was writing in the 60s and 70s. Although he never published any of my work in the journal, he always had interesting things to say in reply, which always made it an exciting or interesting rejection slip. One you could look forward to. It wasn't just, boilerplate. He did not like haiku at all, not just my haiku, but the form itself. He was fearful of what the Japanese syntax might do to the English language or to poetry. Well, that didn't stop me. Here's one of Bly's poems that I enjoyed way back. Driving to town late to mail a letter. Driving to town late to mail a letter. That wasn't the haiku, that was the title. It is a cold and snowy night. The main street is deserted. The only things moving are swirls of snow. As I lift the mailbox door, I feel its cold iron. There's a privacy I love in this snowy night. Driving around, I'll waste more time. There's hardly any main streets now, there's main streets, but they're deserted. And of course, who needs to drive about late at night in the cold and snow to mail a letter? One can send an email at home from the warmth of one's computer. I know some of you will have a problem with his desire to waste more time, but I suspect in his driving around to waste more time, he'll have other experiences that will help him to write more poems. Okay, get ready. Here's a section of my haiku that deal with snow and cold. This way, that way, she tries her hair, more snow in the wind. This way, that way, she tries her hair, more snow in the wind. My wife's still asleep, snow piles up on the steps. My wife's still asleep, snow piles up on the steps. Morning quiet, snow sticking to this side of the telephone poles. Morning quiet, snow sticking to this side of the telephone poles. Last night's snow, deer tracks, deer hunter tracks. Last night's snow, deer tracks, deer hunter tracks. The wind somewhere else, bird tracks in a light snow. The wind somewhere else, bird tracks in a light snow. Snow now rain, your picture by mine. Snow now rain, your picture by mine. Night snow, the house creaks. Night snow, the house creaks. The library book overdue, slow falling snow. The library book overdue, slow falling snow. The cough of my wife, louder than a snowstorm outside. The cough of my wife, louder than a snowstorm outside. The day starts with warnings of snow, her pile of old birthday cards in the trash. The day starts with warnings of snow, her pile of old birthday cards in the trash. I bet some of you are feeling snowed under. But there are more to come. Winters were very long in northern Maine. New layers of snow, the rest of the universe to search on foot. New layers of snow, the rest of the universe to search on foot. Colors missing from the sunrise, parts of the snow stay snow. Colors missing from sunrise, parts of the snow stay snow. Her hospital room, snow filling the small field next to the big one. Her hospital room, snow filling the small field next to the big one. Afternoon's end, the space the falling snow takes. Afternoon's end, the space the fallen snow takes. Between telephone calls, the snow drifting off from the rest of my life. Between telephone calls, the snow drifting off from the rest of my life. Under melting snow, our dead-end street. Under melting snow, our dead-end street. Flurries, snow flurries, which card to play? Flurries, snow flurries, which card to play? Snowflakes no one will miss, melt in her hand. Snowflakes no one will miss, melt in her hand. One might think that was quite a blizzard. Of course, for a real blizzard, one needs lots of wind. I do have many haiku with wind in them, such as, loud wind, the bed unmade all day. Loud wind, the bed unmade all day. Every way the wind blows, chrysanthemums. Every way the wind blows, chrysanthemums. A new state of mind, the wind doesn't turn the corner with us. A new state of mind, the wind doesn't turn the corner with us. Steady morning wind, lottery tickets on top of the trash. Steady morning wind, lottery tickets on top of the trash. Playground swings, a strong wind replaces the children. Playground swings, a strong wind replaces the children. Too strong to stay with us, spring winds. Too strong to stay with us, spring winds. Sudden wind, the dead squirrel's tail doesn't let go. Sudden wind, the dead squirrel's tail doesn't let go. Years of tradition, the wind knows its way out. Years of tradition, the wind knows its way out. Each lull in the winter wind, you and I. Each lull in the winter wind, you and I. And just to set the record straight, since I have been married, there has never been an unmade bed in our house. It just would not happen. And I tried to explain that away over the years, and then I got to thinking that this haiku was, I write haiku. You don't write necessarily a haiku when something happens to you immediately. You recollect in tranquility, as they say. Anyway, as I got to thinking about the haiku, I realized it was an event from much earlier days in my life. The house I lived in while growing up on a farm in northern Maine was an old one. The second floor where I had my bedroom was not heated directly, only by some warm air floating its way up the stairs. So on many winter days, it was a very cold place to be. So one did not spend much time in the room after jumping out of bed. There was not much enthusiasm to stay and make the bed, and the bed could remain that way all day. That's my story about the haiku's unmade bed, and I'm sticking to it. Now for a few haiku that focus on my wife and daughter and now grandsons. Spring wind, my wife drinks from a cup we've always had. Spring wind, my wife drinks from a cup we've always had. Today she's 10, the wind too big for the hand she holds open. Today she's 10, the wind too big for the hand she holds open. Clouds further apart, our daughter kicks the stone off the path. Clouds further apart, our daughter kicks the stone off the path. Autumn colors, our daughter's wedding day circled in red. Autumn colors, our daughter's wedding day circled in red. As far as the light goes, my daughter goes after the firefly. As far as the light goes, my daughter goes after the firefly. Humming to her grandson a tune before any of us were alive. Humming to her grandson a tune before any of us were alive. Running down the street, our grandson's place in the wind. Running down the street, our grandson's place in the wind. And our grandmother's yelling, "Stop!" I worked many years for an intelligence agency, not the CIA, that when people found out, they would say something to the effect that if I told them what I did, I'd have to kill them. My response was to say, no. After 5 minutes, I would have to slap you awake because it was so boring you fell asleep. It happened to me early in my career. I was given a briefing. It was after lunch. The briefer had many slides, so there was a slide projector with its white noise and the hum of the fan. It was also blowing hot air over me since I was sitting near it. Then there was a rhythmic click-click of the slide changer, and I must say the briefing was made up of some very boring, but very highly classified material. I was awakened by the briefer's yell. I certainly was wide awake for the rest of the briefing. Nothing like being yelled at to give one some extra wide awake energy. And of course, there's payback. Once I was given a briefing about my work to a young Army officer, and during the middle of it, he jumped up and said he needed to stand, otherwise he would fall asleep. So you can tell how exciting my work was for him. But I didn't have to slap him awake. Not even my classroom instructors in Air Force basic training were mean to an airman falling asleep in class. The Air Force is a much kinder, gentler military, and as any Marine will tell you, not even a real military. One instructor began the class by saying that if the person beside you fell asleep, then you would get the demerit slip. In the Air Force, there was no forced marches with a heavy backpack as a penalty for falling asleep in class, just a demerit slip because the fellow beside you fell asleep. And of course, the sound of one's own voice can put one to sleep. I've done that to myself. Ask my wife. But I didn't see any of you fall asleep, or you hit it well. But if any one of you had fallen asleep, I would not have slapped you awake. If one of you were asleep at the end of my talk, I would have quietly requested the rest of you who are still awake to leave the room without disturbing the sleeper. Then I would sit down beside the sleeper and tap him or her gently awake. And as they looked around at the empty room, I would say, with all the seriousness I could muster, the rapture has occurred and we are the only ones left. Anyway, thank you for your wide awake faces and kind attention. That's all the haiku you're going to get from me tonight.